Welcome to Underworld UK, where Britain's darkest stories are brought to light. From the gritty streets of gangland London, Liverpool, Manchester and Birmingham, from Curtis Warren to the Cray twins to county lines and modern-day true crime, we cover everything. Bringing you new videos every week. Subscribe so that you'll be notified when the next video is put out.
For more than 40 years, the name John Childs has hovered over British true crime like a bad smell that never quite fades. He has been described as the most prolific hitman the country has ever produced, a man who calmly confessed to multiple contract killings, dismemberment and the complete erasure of his victims. And yet, not a single body has ever been found. No murder weapon was recovered, no forensic trace was produced. What remains instead is a story built almost entirely on the words of one man, words later described by senior judges as the product of a pathological liar. This is not just the story of a supposed hitman, it's the story of how myths are created, how the criminal justice system can become dangerously dependent on confessions, and how one man managed to sit at the centre of Britain's darkest unsolved murders while simultaneously undermining every truth he ever claimed to tell. In the late 1970s, Britain was gripped by fear. Economic decline, labour unrest and rising crime had created an atmosphere where organised criminals were seen as shadowy figures operating beyond the reach of the law. East London in particular had long been associated with gangsters, protection rackets and whispers of professional violence. It was the perfect environment for the idea of a British contract killer to take hold, and John Childs would step neatly into that role. Childs was not arrested for murder. He was arrested in September 1978 for a series of armed robberies, including bank and security van raids across Hertfordshire. These were not the actions of a silent professional assassin. They were the crimes of a man who liked risk, attention and control. But while in custody, something remarkable happened. Childs began to talk, and once he started, he never really stopped. In June 1979, Childs confessed to Detective Chief Superintendent Frank Cater that he had committed multiple murders over a 4-year period. According to Childs, these were not crimes of passion or desperation, they were executions carried out on behalf of others. He claimed he was a hired gun, a fixer for organised criminals operating in and around Essex and East London. The investigation was based out of Waltham Abbey Police Station, and from the beginning it was clear that officers believed they were dealing with something unprecedented. Childs provided names, dates, locations and motives. He spoke confidently, sometimes graphically, about killing 6 people between November 1974 and October 1978. The victims, he said, were Terence Eve, Robert Brown, George Brett, George's 10-year-old son Terry Brett, Frederick or Freddie Sherwood and Ronald Andrews. Every single one of them had vanished. No bodies had ever been recovered. No crime scenes had been identified. And yet Childs' confessions were detailed enough to convince police that they were finally pulling back the curtain on a hidden murder network. At the heart of Childs' story were 2 Essex businessmen, Terry Pinfold and Harry or H. McAnee. Both were former prisoners who'd reinvented themselves as legitimate operators. According to Childs, they were his employers, men who ordered killings to protect their businesses, settle debts and silence potential threats. It was a compelling narrative, criminals going straight on the surface, but using violence behind closed doors to maintain control. In December 1979, Childs stood trial at the Old Bailey. The prosecution, led by John Matthew QC, presented Childs not as a fantasist or a desperate criminal seeking leverage, but as a cold, methodical killer. The absence of bodies was framed not as a weakness, but as proof of his professionalism. He was convicted of all 6 murders and sentenced by Mr. Justice Lawson to 6 concurrent life sentences. For the public, the case appeared settled. Britain, it seemed, had its own contract killer, a man who disposed of bodies so efficiently that nothing was ever found. Newspapers were quick to elevate Childs into a figure of notoriety. The idea that he might be exaggerating or lying barely entered the discussion. But Childs was not finished talking. After his conviction, he agreed to turn Queen's evidence. He would now testify against the men he claimed had hired him. This second phase of the case would become even more disturbing than the first. The disappearance of Terence Eve had long puzzled investigators. Eve was a former prisoner who'd turned his life around, becoming a toy maker in Dagenham. He shared a converted church hall workspace with Pinfold and McAnee, who used the same building to manufacture diving equipment. Eve vanished in November 1974. According to Childs, Eve was killed so that his business could be taken over. He claimed he was beaten, strangled, dismembered and burned. Then there was George Brett, a haulage contractor, and his young son Terry Brett. They disappeared in January 1975. Childs alleged Brett was lured to the factory under the pretense of work. Once inside, he claimed, Harry McAnee shot both father and son with a Sten gun. The sheer horror of this accusation, the murder of a child, stunned the courtroom. Childs went on. Ronald Andrews, he said, was murdered because McAnee was having an affair with Andrews' wife. Freddie Sherwood, a nursing home owner, was killed over a £7,000 debt. Robert Brown, he claimed, knew too much about Eve's murder and had to be silenced. At times, Childs portrayed himself as both executioner and victim. He told the court he was terrified of McAnee, so much so that he'd once considered killing him with a crossbow. It was an extraordinary image, Britain's most feared hitman living in fear of his own employer. The second trial began in October 1980 and lasted 8 weeks. Childs had spent 15 months in solitary confinement prior to giving evidence. The judge was Mr. May. The prosecution was led by David Tudor Price. McAnee's defence lawyer was Michael Mansfield QC, one of the most formidable barristers in the country. Despite the lack of physical evidence, despite the absence of bodies, and despite the fact that the entire case rested almost exclusively on Childs' testimony, the jury convicted Pinfold and McAnee. McAnee was sentenced to life imprisonment and reportedly had to be restrained by guards when the sentence was passed. Leonard Thompson and Paul Morton Thurkel were acquitted. Once again, the narrative appeared complete. A hitman, his employers, a hidden murder spree finally exposed. But beneath the surface, the foundations of the case were already beginning to rot. While serving his sentence, Childs continued to talk, to prisoners, to journalists, to pen friends, and crucially, his stories began to change. In July 1986, while held at HMP Winchester, Childs wrote a statement admitting that Terry Pinfold had been convicted solely on the basis of his perjured evidence. Years later, he would describe in lurid detail how he supposedly dismembered bodies and burned them in a 55-gallon drum inside his council flat in Poplar. The image was grotesque, almost theatrical, a domestic space transformed into an incinerator. In interviews with the Daily Mirror in the late 1990s, Childs went even further, claiming he had committed 5 additional murders. These confessions made front-page news. The myth of John Childs grew larger, darker, and more extreme. He was no longer just a hitman, he was being painted as a uniquely evil figure in British criminal history. But as his body count increased, so did doubts. 2 prisoners came forward during the second trial, stating that Childs had privately admitted to falsely implicating McAnee. According to them, Childs feared that if he did not shift blame, his wife Tina might be accused of murder. This raised an unsettling possibility, that Childs' confessions were not driven by guilt or honesty, but self-preservation.
By the 1990s, cracks were impossible to ignore. Childs' accounts of the murders shifted repeatedly. Details changed, motives altered. In some versions, victims were killed for business reasons, in others for personal grudges. At one point, Childs even wrote a letter suggesting that his wife had asked him to kill Terence Eve after Eve allegedly sexually assaulted her, a claim entirely at odds with his earlier stories. Behind the scenes, serious concerns were being raised about Childs' mental state. A forensic psychiatrist, Dr. David Sommick, concluded that Childs suffered from a personality disorder that compelled him to lie. Crucially, the original juries had never been told this. The courts had accepted his testimony without understanding the psychological framework behind it. In December 2003, after years of campaigning and a referral by the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the Court of Appeal finally re-examined the convictions of Terry Pinfold and Harry McAnee. Lord Wolfe, sitting with Mr. Justice Akins and Mr. Justice Davis, delivered a devastating judgment. John Childs, the court ruled, was a pathological liar. His evidence was unreliable. The convictions were unsafe. Pinfold and McAnee walked free. The implications were staggering. Two men had spent more than 20 years in prison, largely based on the words of a man the courts now openly acknowledged could not be trusted. And yet John Childs remained behind bars, serving a whole life tariff. This raised a question that still haunts the case. If Childs' testimony was unreliable, what exactly was he guilty of?